Hello again, John Florez here with our final episode on the great composers and arrangers that I worked with during my years in the music business. I saved my best friend for last. Darnielle Pershing died at a very, very, very young age, and I miss him dearly. I'll tell you about what happened toward the end of his life. I'll leave that last. Let's just start at the beginning. How's that? So in 1970, I left RCA Records, where I'd been a staff producer for 2.5 years, and I had decided to go independent, which means I could work for any label that offered me work. At the time, Lindy Blasky, who was a song plugger, and his wife, Holly Smith, were close social friends of my wife Carol's and mine. And Holly, Lindy's wife, knew of a group called The Establishment. She had a good friend who was a singer in a group. It was Las Vegas based, called The Establishment. It was 4 men and 4 women, very show busy. And since I loved vocal groups, I asked if I could be introduced to them and possibly do their first record that would be coming up shortly with a label that was somewhere in the South. So I met with the group and their manager, Leonard Grant, and I got the job. That was my first job as an independent, and it was done full orchestra. And the man who introduced himself, who was the arranger-conductor for the group, was this short little man with kind of a limp because he had a bad hip, Darnielle Pershing. And he put out his hand and he said, "John, I'm Darnielle Pershing. It's a pleasure to meet you." That was the beginning of a friendship that I will treasure for the rest of my life. Now, The Establishment had a lead singer, Larry Meredith. I'll play you the cut that I produced on The Establishment in a moment. And Larry Meredith would go on to be a solo artist for me on Bell Records. But back in 1970, everybody assembled at RCA and things went very quickly and very smoothly, which, as you have gathered by now if you've been watching my videos, is the way I liked it. Assembly line style, quick, easy, and out, and move on to the next project. I'm not really proud of that, but that's just the way I was. So we made this record, In My Heart I Am a Free Man, and let's listen to a brief sample of that.
My soul is ready to fly, and I want to say my goodbye to Mama and Papa who wanted for me someday be someone I never can be. In my heart I am a free man. I dream of a life with no plan. In my heart there is a free man. Tells me to live and I can.
Now let's fast forward a few years, because in 1970, when I did The Establishment, I was getting ready within a year to go become a staff producer at Bell Records, which is now called Orchestra Records. Clive Davis came in and changed the name of the label. And I was the LA staff producer for Bell Records. I was unable to do most of the acts I wanted to do, other than one of the singles that I produced while I was staff at Bell was on Larry Meredith, The Establishment's lead singer, from 1970. So as I'm doing this session, in walks Darnielle Pershing, and Darnielle says, "John, how are you? It's nice to see you again. By the way, if you ever have any work down the line for an arranger, if you could just throw me into your rotation. I know you're using some of the other guys, but I would really appreciate it." And that's really when things started to pick up. We did a lot of work together from that point on. Well, the first session that Darnielle did for me in 1973 happened to be Hughes Corporation cuts, and we had already recorded Rock the Boat, we had already recorded Freedom for the Stallion, and Darnielle and Perry Botkin were assigned the remaining cuts. So let me give you a brief excerpt of a couple cuts that Darnielle did, And if I played them side by side with Perry's cuts on the Hughes Corporation, I don't think you'd hear much of a difference. They wrote very similarly. And the project really came out just fine. It's certainly nothing to write home about, but we had Freedom for the Stallion and Rock the Boat, and the other cuts were quite nice. Here are a couple excerpts of Darnielle's work on that project.
Flowers took to Daddy, and Daddy he took to gold. Sister took to black real nice, and Mama cried alone. And I took the train out of there. I told the engineer I don't believe there's no help handy. Heaven help the tie that binds the family.
Next up was a solo effort by James Bingham, or J.B. Bingham, who was the lead singer of Five Flights Up. Lenny Waronker at Warner Brothers offered me a singles deal on J.B., so we went in and cut him. What was fun about this date is that I learned two things. The first is you're in big trouble when one of your rhythm players comes in and has had something like, I don't know, marital issues. It could be anything. Back in the RCA days, the stock market went down a couple hundred points, and all of a sudden all the studio musicians vacated my session to get to their telephones to find out about their stocks and bonds. But in this case, one of our studio musicians came in on James Bingham's date and had this horrible personal news to report, and the whole room sank, and I don't think we ever got the energy out of that date that we wanted. So I learned that, oh my, if there's some deep stuff going on with people's lives, it can affect your rhythm date. And maybe you're best to cancel it, actually. But in those days, my gosh, you hired union musicians and you paid for them for 3 hours, whether you used them or not. So we went ahead and did the date. Now what I'd like to do is play you an excerpt of James Bingham's Peekaboo, which was our single for Warner Brothers. And I'd like to play you, as part of that excerpt, the way it sounded when I mixed it back in 1973 and didn't know what the hell I was doing, and how I've remastered the same section, I'll show you just the section, currently, which is the way it should have sounded in the first place, but I didn't know any better. And I've talked to you about that in previous videos, how I learned to hype records much more in my later years. Probably in the 80s I learned that. But it sure took me a long time because I was a slow learner. I just kind of did that assembly line thing and hell with the rest. Bad attitude. Or bad work ethic. Probably both. So here's the before and after on James Bingham's Peekaboo.
My love grows and grows much more than before. So maybe I'll just say, oh, Peekaboo, guess who's watching you? I'll wait just one more day, just to see you. Oh, Peekaboo, guess who's watching you? Oh, Peekaboo, guess who's watching you?
Now I said I learned two things from this session, and the second one is that the strings that I've told you about before, I don't like them super high and the register they're pitched in, but I didn't really know that at the time. I've kind of, I don't know, got used to them being that way because all the other guys were writing that way for me. And so when Darnielle did it with James Bingham, and when I kind of compared our version of Peekaboo versus Tom Bell, who wrote and produced the Stylistics version of Peekaboo, I thought, uh-oh, we're going to have to lower the register of the strings. So from that point on, Darnielle and I went lower with our string parts, but never low enough because I still didn't quite get it. Then in 1974, right out of the box, this unusual deal was struck. Harvey Cooper, my dear, dear friend and business partner at the time, called his contact at CBS Records, Mickey Eichner, and said, "Mickey, John Florez would like to produce Ronnie Dyson for free." Now, I was hot because the Hughes Corporation was hot at the moment, so offering my services for free was something that was just absolutely unheard of. By the way, I offered Motown the same opportunity. I wanted to work with Thelma Houston, and they laughed me off and didn't allow me to do it. And they told me in retrospect that I had devalued myself by offering it for free. But no, it's always a way in the door, so to speak, of an organization. And I hadn't worked for CBS in the case of Ronnie Dyson. So this was a good way in. And the deal that Harvey struck with Mickey Eichner was that if they liked my work with Ronnie Dyson, they would allow me to do the next Johnny Mathis album. And that's the way it worked out. That was so cool. Anyway, Ronnie Dyson had had a hit with a song called The Way That I Want to Touch You. And then Tom Bell tried an album with him, and that did kind of so-so. So I was right kind of in between producers with him, and this was perfect. So the couple of cuts that we did, Life and Breath, which formerly was recorded by Larry Cox's group Climax with Sonny Qureshi, I can barely say his name, as lead singer, we did with Ronnie Dyson, and then a McManus-Podrosky song, My Writers, called Captain of Your Soul. And I'm quite pleased with them. Here's an excerpt from both of them.
If you believe in dreams enough, then they'll believe in you. That's what you used to tell me, so I know it must be true. 'Cause day after day, I'm dreaming you come back to me. 'Cause you are life and breath to me. Hey! Stone cold people pushing you to the ground, laying their rap on you, they're bound to bring you down. People don't care, they don't give a damn, you got to be the lead man. The captain of the soul. Captain, hey, 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 the captain of the soul. You got to be the captain of the soul. You got to be the captain.
In the meantime, I've gotten a call from my attorney, Abe Summer, who said that Clive Davis wanted to interview me for The Fifth Dimension. Rock the Boat was #1 in the world at the time, and The Fifth Dimension was interested in kind of getting a hipper sound than they had had with Bones Howe, who did pretty middle-of-the-road stuff, though, gosh, it was great work. I don't know, particularly for me, I loved the Up, Up and Away album, which Johnny Rivers and Bones Howe did, and I loved Aquarius. I did not like those sweet ballads that Marilyn was doing so well, so beautifully, but they were a little too sweet for me. Ha! Because I was known for making sweet records myself. I'm a hypocrite. Okay, so moving right along, we were supposed to hippen The Fifth Dimension a little bit. Okay. So they wanted more, say, Friends of Distinction out of The Fifth Dimension. Bones Howe they'd use some of his cuts for the album, and they'd use some of mine, and a couple of other tracks that they had in the vault. So Darnell and I got on a plane, and we went back to either Rhode Island or New Hampshire to meet with the group for the first time and introduce ourselves. Well, that was kind of interesting, because Darnell, I've told you, he's probably the #1 prankster I've ever had in my life. Darnell knew that my mother had taught our family not to drink out of other people's drink glasses. So we're on this first-class flight, thanks to Arista, on the way back to meet The Fifth Dimension, and I come back from the restroom, and Darnell says, "Enjoying your drink, John?" And I said, "Oh yeah, Darnell, it's really good." And he said, "Well, that's excellent, because I licked the entire top rim while you were in the restroom." Did he or didn't he? I'll never know. But he broke me of this trait that I had been taught to not drink out of other people's glasses. From that point on, I drank out of other people's glasses. Thank you, Darnielle Pershing. So we met the group back in New Hampshire. We scheduled a rehearsal around a piano that would be coming up in Chicago. So we flew back to Chicago to do our first piano voice sessions. The group and I had already picked the tunes together in their conference room with everybody assembled, raising their hands yay or nay for what songs they wanted to do and who would sing leads on them. So Darnielle and I are in Chicago, and we're getting ready for rehearsal, and Darnielle and I are out by the lake, just passing the time before rehearsal, and Darnielle turns to me and he says, "I got to tell you something, John." And he said, "I've had a fear my entire life. I've never told anybody about it." I said, "Okay, what's that?" And he said, "It's big black men with switchblades, and we're in Chicago, and I'm scared. Walking down the street, I'm scared." And I said, "Oh, no, there's nothing. We'll be fine. Come on now." So we go back to the hotel to rehearse the fifth, and we go to the conference room, and there's the piano, and the fifth arrives, and we all gather around the piano, and Darnielle's sitting on the piano bench, and Ron Townsend, the big guy, bless his heart and rest in peace, sits down next to Darnielle, knows nothing about what Darnielle and I have just been sharing with each other, and pulls out this enormous switchblade and starts cleaning his nails with it. I thought Darnielle was going to, pardon the expression, have a heart attack, which he eventually, end of this episode, I'll tell you about, because he did have one, but nothing to do with switchblades. Anyway, the rehearsal went very, very well, and we came back and we did the tracks with Ed Green on drums, who really shone, along with the other players that we always use. There was kind of a set group of people, but in the case of the rhythm guys, Ed Green stood out. And then when we did the orchestra sessions, they just went smooth as cake. Remember my telling you Perry Botkin had me sit down and go over parts before we go into the studio? Well, Darnielle and I would do that every time as well. So there were no surprises, everything went smoothly, and we were thrilled. We had maybe 3 songs that represented different views of the fifth dimension, but they all were socially significant, kind of like my doing Freedom for the Stallion with the Hughes Corporation. So we had No Love in the Room, which was a McManus Pedrosky, our writer's tune, which talks about a family that's having problems. So trouble in the family, that's the social value number 1. Second song was Hardcore Poetry, written by Lambert and Potter, and it was about basically how you see the ghetto. Do you see the ghetto as a positive or a negative or both? And the third song was Harlem, written by Bill Withers, and this was a giant departure for the fifth dimension, and it was an experiment for all of us, because we had James Gadsden on drums, who's just a lumberjack, number 1 dance drummer in town, and the song itself is about life in Harlem. Even the intro to the song, we were able to find a movie soundtrack of kids yelling out on a street in Harlem, and we added that to the front of the record. So we finished this session, and you've heard about it on my Fifth Dimension video, so I won't really go into marketing-wise or career-wise what happened to everybody involved. But I was really pleased, and Darnielle and I had done Ronnie Dyson and Fifth Dimension back-to-back, and this is good stuff. I really liked it. I asked the Fifth Dimension how they felt about our sessions, they said, really nice compliment, that this was the happiest they had been since the Up, Up, and Away album. Well, okay, that may be a little excessive because they won a Grammy with Bones for Aquarius, but I was pleased, and I said, what'd you think of Darnielle? And they said, it's really good work, John, but we don't understand the movement. He moves in odd places. Okay, now that sounds like kind of a generic statement, and that's the way it was presented, and I only figured it out when I got in the car on the way home. They were talking bass parts. The moving note bass parts were something that I had asked Darnielle to start doing 2 or 3 years prior and forgot that I told him. So now, 40 years later, I'm saying, oh, I maybe would like more structured bass parts with a little bit of movement in them. Back then, I was working on a 3-year-old pattern where, oh, a bass part was a bass part. No, the Fifth Dimension was correct, and I hadn't even realized what I had been doing or been asking Darnielle to do. Oh well, here we go again, John. Also in 1974, I was offered Carl Graves, and Carl was a singer at A&M, and they believed in him a lot. He was a pop black singer, and in retrospect, I was a jerk, because basically I said, Carl, I'm hot at the moment as a producer. I've got some songwriters that are writing great songs. I've got a background group of singers that have a unique sound to them, and Darnielle and I have the same rhythm players, and we have a formula, and I'd like to put you into that formula, which we did. Now that was really arrogant of me. That's very Phil Spector of me, and that's normally not who I am or the way I work. But I'll be damned, it worked. And what it basically was we call it the hero concept. And that is Linda Seals, with the sound of the background group, would basically in songs introduce Carl so that when his lines came in after theirs, he would be the hero of the song. I ended up using this a lot the rest of my career, including having the Fifth Dimension, having people step out all the time to have their hero moments. But Carl and Darnielle and I had a big hit record with Baby Hang Up the Phone, and there were 2 or 3 other cuts on the album that were also really interesting. Now what's special about this that's coming up is that other than Baby Hang Up the Phone, none of these songs were ever released. So you're hearing them here at my site, whether you've heard them before when I posted them or not, for the first time ever, because they're still sitting in a tape vault at A&M. So here we go with Baby Hang Up the Phone and more.